Portland. So basically in our work, we're going to jump right in, and what we're tracking are what we call these three bodies. And so you got your physical body here, there's a person, and then the brown circles is called the fluid body, and it's also called the mid-tide. One of the things that's happening in our profession is there's a little bit of naming the same thing three different ways. So the fluid body is also called the tidal body, the mid-tide, and the tidal body is out beyond this little, we also call this edge the biosphere. So around your body, you have like an egg that kind of contains your little energy field. And in craniosacral, we call that the biosphere. That's a Dr. Becker term, one of the original osteopaths in cranial work. And by the way, a lot of this information was picked up from Dr. Sutherland, who kind of put cranial work together, but Dr. Sutherland originated cranial work, but he got a lot of his information from Dr. Still, who was the founder of osteopathy, and Dr. Still got a lot of his information from Native American healing. So really this work comes from Native American healing that's been westernized, and the more esoteric aspects of it have been hush, 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 because we want everybody to like us and be accepted. And now there's a new movement in the profession to kind of, which I'm a part of, to sort of, let's talk about where it really came from. Dr. Still was part Lumbee, which is a tribe I'd never heard of. And he worked on a reservation with his father, who was a physician, and then he became a physician. And anyways, it's quite interesting, and all that information just came out in the past like year. So we have our physical body, and then if you want to just take a second just to feel the edge where your skin is, and just even your intention, just to bring your attention outside of that, that's the fluid body. And then beyond that are these other fields within fields, and we name a layer called the tidal body. So this is kind of, biodynamic is called biodynamic because it kind of goes outside of the body and connects us with the unified field of nature, the natural world. So the root of everything in our work is something called dynamic stillness, and everything arises from dynamic stillness, which is where there's potential for anything to happen. Then it starts to move into motion and expression. We call that the breath of life. These old osteopaths didn't have words for this, so they borrowed, some of the words they borrowed were biblical, because they didn't have words for Ayurvedic words for chakras and auras and all those, indigenous words that aren't Western. So they called it the breath of life. So the breath of life steps down into its first movement in our work that we talk about. By the way, there are other tides, but we just don't focus on them. Steps down into what we call the long tide. And that long tide is in the tidal body. So the long tide is out here in this yellow zone. So the long tide has an expression, and it goes through all living matter of inhalation from our midline, out beyond our physical body, out beyond our biosphere, out into nature through the natural world of inhalation 50 seconds and exhalation 50 seconds towards our midline. Now, in physics, which I love, it's one of my favorite subjects, esoteric physics, they talk about the Boson-Higgs and different things like that, where it's actually energy that lines up the matter. So this is where that long tide in our embryology, when we're little itty bitty babies, we're not even babies, we're just cells. It's an energy that comes in after conception and starts to line up the tissue field. So that's pretty much the long tide. They've measured it in, we have a movie we show in school called, what is it called? Slime mold. It's about slime mold. And they actually measure the long tide breathing through this single cellular organism uh, called slime mold, which I knew nothing about before I became a student and teacher. So then the long tide steps down into the mid tide. So it starts to get more specific to your system. And then it has more specificity and comes in, and it's almost like if you have the power plant is dynamic stillness, the solar field, and then the power lines coming off that is the long tide, and then the telephone pole with the wire to your house, that's the mid tide. So the mid tide would be your own personal body, your own personal space. Then there's another layer that we don't work with at all or study, but other cranial practitioners work with, called the cranial rhythmic impulse. And that's people in Upledger's cranial work and other forms of cranial work very specifically in a little area, and it's very quick. It's 1 2 3 1 2 3. If you've ever tried to feel any of these rhythms in the body, that's one that's pretty easy to tune into if you're holding someone's feet or holding their head. And that's very localized at a specific joint or a specific organ or a specific tissue. But all these other tides are also coming through. They're just kind of like all expressing at once, but you're listening to different instruments in an orchestra playing. So there's an orchestra playing, but you can hear the French horn, you can hear the violin, you can hear the trombone. So you're kind of tuning your, as a practitioner, you learn to listen to different aspects of that orchestra. That's what the training is, part of what the training's about. Dynamic stillness is, like I said, the basis of everything. So one of the things that we work on a lot in the training is really, really settling our nervous system. Because the more still we become and the more quiet we get, the more information we pick up on, and the more we're able to kind of connect to these deeper states. It's a different way of being to tune into these states, almost like with acupuncture. When you check someone's pulse, it's a really different way of listening to the pulse. It's just kind of similar to that. So this is where that breath of life starts to arise from dynamic stillness. When you're in dynamic stillness, it's not an often place to hang out. It's very peaceful. It's very nourishing. It's very settling. It's very resourcing. And it's just a really special, special place when this arises in a session. Everything gets very quiet. And all of the healing processes, all the tides that we're talking about, and the still points and things that arise are rooted in this dynamic stillness. So here's the breath of life. Then that starts to emerge. It's a divine presence that comes from that stillness. And it's a real direct connection to the source. And people have different names for it. Um, but it's just, it's the beautiful thing is that when you're a cranial therapist, biodynamic, you don't always have to know exactly what's happening, because as long as you're orienting to the health, which is the same as the blueprint, the same as the breath of life. As long as you're orienting to that, you're listening to an intelligence that is far beyond any of us here on the planet. Doesn't matter how long you go to school or how long you study. So you can really rely on that and trust that to know what to do. You don't have to always be figuring out what to do. You actually try to unlearn during the training, doing, and just there is a little bit of doing. We talk about it, we call it augmenting, but really you're focusing on this breath of life. That's what generates this inhalation of energy in the body and exhalation. And the breath of life does not hold any trauma. That's why it's beautiful. So when you orient to that, it can really help people that have been through some things and help them process it and feel very resourced when their body is and their mind and their heart is starting to kind of move through things. When you're working in this field, it's very safe generally with people who've been through things in life, which most of us have. So it's a wonderful way to kind of it's like I'm going to talk about it in a slide, but you're bringing in this third layer. You're bringing in um, the practitioner, the client, and then the breath of life. So you're kind of bringing all three together in the sessions. This directs the planet, everything that lives on the planet, the solar system. And if you study physics, there's these toroid structures all throughout on a micro level and a macro level, and universes and stars and the sun, and the planet has these toroidal, like a donut kind of motions of energy. And that's what this is, the breath of life. So then the breath of life starts to come into our awareness through what we call the long tide. And it doesn't have imprints in it, doesn't have chaos. It's very slow, very stable. And it's 50 seconds on inhalation and 50 seconds exhalation. You can really feel when you're in the long tide and you're orienting to that, you really feel connected to everything. You feel like this unification of you and the earth. And I threw this little picture in because if you can think of how, here's the sun, here's the earth, and look at this blue, that's the ocean. And you can see how the moon affects the tides in the ocean. So just imagine what these things are doing in our systems, which are we have cerebrospinal fluid in our system. We're made up of 80% water. So all of these things are interconnected. The mid tide is very important. We start the training with this tide, focusing on this because it's the embodiment tide. It's the tide that really connects you to your body. And it's very important to be in your body because your body does not lie. It does not have an ego. It's just like this little 6-year-old, and it just feels things. It feels sensations, um, and it's a very grounding. It's a really grounding tide. It helps you stay. It helps you be very stable. It helps you feel safe in your body. It helps you support groundedness and not dissociating or going into fight flight. And it's a very supportive tide of being in your body. So we really work with this in the beginning of the training. It moves in a unified action of movement. So that's a big difference with biodynamic is we work with this tide and the long tide, but in this work, we look at the body as this unified field, not just the physical body, but in this picture, this biosphere around the body, we look at that whole system as a unified field, not like just this little piece up here, the ear or the toe. We kind of see how everything is influencing the entire field. And what happens is there's a fluid drive called potency. So the potency kind of comes up and starts to expand out through the body and go to the edge of the biosphere in the mid-tide and then come back and drop down. And some people have more oomph, it's like voltage, and their potency, they have more drive, they have a stronger voltage. And then other people, like if they've had maybe potentially anesthesia or something like that, the potency can be a little bit dampened. Yeah. So they call it reciprocal tension motion. That's a Dr. Sutherland statement. And what that means is it reciprocates. It goes from exhalation, inhalation. So it reciprocates back and forth about 1 to 3 cycles a minute. And the cool thing is that, you know, when you work in the mid-tide, you're seeing how this potency is coming into the tissue field. And what happens sometimes is parts of our system get a little bit blocked off from that potency. And so it's not getting as strongly connected to this intelligence in the body. This intelligence that, you know, when you cut your hand, you just, oh, you're like, whoops, I cut my hand. I'm going to go wash it, right? Maybe you put a salve on it or something. You put a Band-Aid on it. And then you keep it clean, right? And then, oh, a couple days later, it starts to scab and then it starts to heal up, right? How the heck does your body know how to do that? We don't tell it. Those are the forces that we're tuning into. And we're going beyond the biochemistry and the macrophage cells and the white blood cells and the red blood cells. We're going beyond that. We're going into the things that make up the red blood cells and the things that make up the white blood cells, the atoms and the electrons and protons. And then you keep going back and you're in the land of space between all those atoms that are directing those atoms. We're in the land of we don't know, right? And that's what we're talking about is this thing that we can all tune into and feel that science hasn't quite caught up to. They've caught up to a little bit with the Boston Higgs, the CERN Institute in Switzerland, with the 0 point field that Dr. McTaggart talks about in her book called oh gosh, what is that book called? But anyways, you know, they're starting to approach it, the God particle, things like that in science. So it's an embodiment tide. You perceive the system as a whole. And the tissues move as a whole. So it's almost like your body is in this fluid and you're like seaweed being breathed by that fluid that's moving the seaweed and kind of breathing through it. And there's a unified field. And there can be inertia, which is a fancy word for stuck. It's a physics word. Inertia means stuck. I like to simplify things.
I'll go for a walk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the fluid motility, this motion of in your tissue field, in your body and outside of your body, is sensed in this mid-tide, which is also called the fluid tide. The big thing about the mid-tide is that this is where imprints are. This is where your birth pattern is imprinted. Your relational field is imprinted in this tide with your parents or growing up. your accidents, if you might have fallen, even your positive experiences where you fell in love or you learned something really exciting. That's all held in the mid-tide. The cranial rhythmic impulse feels a little bit more like New York City, where I used to live. And although that building right there looks like Portland, a building in Portland, it's a bit faster. And in this biodynamic realm, we kind of think it's a human-made conditional force that humans have kind of created in the Western world. Some people say people that don't live at this fast of a pace, and people that are more indigenous cultures where there's not as many cars and busyness in cities, they can't feel this pulse in those people's system. So it's really interesting. But in our culture, it's a bit more left brain. It's much more narrow perceptual field. You're kind of tuning in a really narrow way. It's very logical and specific and less spacious and wide. We don't really work with this field. Upledger work and other forms of cranial work, they work with this, although everything's starting to blend together now. One of the things that's so important in our work is embryology, because our embryological roots, how we began, basically are the root of our blueprint. So our blueprint actually is an expression of the breath of life directing us into differentiating into each and every one of us as a human being. We all have our own blueprint, and that blueprint is in relationship to the breath of life. And so that blueprint comes in with the two cells and starts to direct those cells and DNA and to line up and form us into a human being. There's a really neat video that we watch in the class where they accidentally left a tadpole conception under a microscope, and they showed the electromagnetic field line up the midline of the tadpole, and the eyes formed around the electromagnetic lining up of the blueprint. You could just see it happening. It was really cool. Blueprint is a word that Anna Chitty created, and she has a school out in Colorado, in Boulder, Colorado. So the fluid body is also called the mid-tide. Just so you know, it's includes the physical body and just outside of the body about 12 to 15 inches. It's also called the biosphere, and it can have imprints. One of the things that Franklin Sills brought to the work, which is really great, is called the holistic shift. And he has a very specific way that I teach in his lineage of how we start a session. In the holistic shift, you really don't do any work. You don't go to any specific areas until the holistic shift happens. And that means when you're holding someone's feet, you get a sense of the body. You can sometimes, I've actually felt it, like I'll sense their body at the feet, and then I'll feel this energy just go whoop, and like the little balloon just kind of fills out. That's the holistic shift. It doesn't always feel that strong, but you get a sense of the whole person as a unified field. And that's what we try and really deepen into during a session. And it's not like it's not like an endpoint. You drive to the end of the street and park in the parking spot. It's a process that you go through during a session. And as you treat people more and more, each time it goes deeper and deeper and deeper, the holistic shift. babies are amazing. They are very close to the blueprint. That's why they're so fun to work with. They don't have the protective parts that we need as adults called the ego and the mind that's very strong with its judgments and opinions. Their field is very open, and they're very right-brained. And so when they're in that space, you can access the intelligence and the breath of life, and they're pretty much in the long tide most of the time. So it's really pretty amazing to work with babies. And when we're babies, we're clean slates. So we what happens is usually generally the first 5 years of life, things happen and they teach us things, and we get little imprints of our learning experience. And imprints aren't just difficult things, they're just life. And we get cultural imprints, we get ancestral imprints, things that our parents did, that their parents did. Um, so baby is just like completely open, and then they're just experiencing. They always want to put things in their mouth and touch things, and what's this, and play with things. And so they're just exploring and learning. And sometimes what can happen is there can be some difficult imprints there. And Bruce Lipton has written a really good book called Biology of Belief about this. And he talks about ways to kind of clear out those, I call them background apps. It's like there are these apps that are playing all the time that might not be so supportive of your health and your own blueprint. And um, this is one of the places where our work can really, really support people, because these come up during sessions, and they come up in the process of, journeying through a session. And sometimes they come into consciousness, and sometimes they come into the body as a felt sense in the body. You can feel tightness or clenching somewhere, and it's quite interesting. One of the biggest and most important things, though, is that Franklin's wife, Maura Sills, brought in something called the relational field. And they have a school over in England, and she teaches Buddhist psychodynamic or Buddhist psychology. And she really said, you know, it's very important to emphasize relationship in this work, emphasize the relationship between the practitioner and the client, the teacher, and the student. That is so important, because if there is safety in the relational field, that's where nervous system regulation happens, because the highest level of safety that one can have in their nervous system is being with another person that they feel safe with, that they feel is attuned, that they feel is regulated. And most of us are wounded from relationships, and most of us are healed. The highest level of healing is in relationship. So we talk a lot about the relational field and really co-creating safety in the relational field for our clients, and really settling our nervous system and teaching our clients how to regulate their nervous system. And taking pauses is a big principle that we talk about in the training, which means just taking a little time to check in with your nervous system and see what it's doing. Like, just take a second now and feel your seat, feel your feet. What do you feel in your body? I feel a little buzzing in my midline because I'm talking, because I'm up in my brain a little bit, but my body is also kind of, oh, I love talking about this stuff. I get a little excited. So you might feel spacey, or you might feel tingling or buzzing, or you might feel really grounded and rooted. So those things, like just starting to use your noticing brain, your medial prefrontal cortex, starting to notice your body is a really good way to regulate your nervous system. And we do that during sessions when we're holding someone's feet or their head or their sacrum or their side. We're actually tuning into our own nervous system quite a bit, maybe in the beginning, like at least 50% of the time, and regulating our own nervous system. And then we're coming back into the field with the person. So it's not like a traditional work where you just focus on that other person. I'm going to give them a massage, or I'm going to do this or that, chiropractic or whatever. You actually are included in the process in the session. And in doing so, and being and learning to regulate your nervous system, some of us had to learn that on our own as adults, because people like myself, the youngest of 6 children. So growing up, there wasn't a lot of slow, grounded settling. There was a lot of playing and jumping around and playing games, and it was very social nervous system, playing social nervous system, but it wasn't very grounded. So when I you know got out on my own, I had to start really learning to slow my nervous system down, and just using my body to do that, using noticing my body to do that, which is the best. I think it's the best way to do it. And when you do this, it really magnifies the blueprint. It really brings in the blueprint, the health, the intelligence into the picture more. So I just did this picture the other day. I really like it. It's like the Holy Trinity. My version of the Holy Trinity is a grounded and safe practitioner who's regulated in their own system, focusing on and orienting to the client's own blueprint, their health, and then really bringing in the breath of life and bringing that into the awareness of the session, the different layers of the breath of life that might arise, the mid tide, the long tide, still points, dynamic stillness. Focusing particularly, it's very easy to be with somebody and say, this is wrong and that's wrong. And have you ever been around people like that that are very scrutinizing and just, this is wrong with that? What do you think of that tree? Well, it's crooked and it's got a branch that's about to fall off, and you know, that part's growing faster than that part. We don't do that in our work. We train ourselves to be like, wow, look at that tree. Look what it's doing, how it's done such a great job. And let's really notice those other things, but let's really focus on how healthy that tree is, how it's growing through New England winters and plow trucks going by. It's been doing pretty okay with all that and not having enough water this winter. And, to look at it more in a kind of a blueprint orientation, health orientation. But what can happen in session is, we have to deal with our brain, right? Especially our left brain, right? DJ subconscious, right? All your thoughts, nonstop, uninterrupted, 24 hours a day. The golden oldies. You can hear them. People sing about them. Yeah, people sing about these imprints. You can hear, I don't know, I'm just thinking of different songs out there, that talk about these things. There's some, I can't think of lyrics right now, but I'm sure you guys all know. I'm hungry, I'm bored. So that has to be included too, and just seen and heard, and then, settled and put aside. So we name these layers, these different layers that we're noticing as we're settling. And we sometimes we can put them aside, but other times we do something called resourcing, which some of you guys might know about, which is to just kind of redirect our focus on something that's resourcing, where particularly we had a felt sense in our body of settling and calm and groundedness and safety. So it could be an external resource of that hike I went on in New Hampshire, or it could be an internal resource, my breath, things like that. And we teach this to our clients and have them focus on that. And that's a big part, is especially up here in New England, is working with the mental body is part of the training, is like kind of learning how to work with that, the nonstop questioning mind, and getting comfortable with not always knowing exactly what's happening, what you're feeling, and just keep orienting to grounding and settling. And Candace Pert was an amazing scientist, and she's written some books. And she said, your body is your subconscious mind, and you can't heal by talk alone. You can't heal your body just by talking. Um, you have to heal your body by feeling safe and feeling connected and feeling grounded and feeling nervous system regulation. And so that's a big thing that we try and kind of teach people, and then bring that out in the world. And probably the biggest principle around that is the pause principle, is one of the ways we do that. And Ray Castellino was a teacher who sadly recently passed, and he taught pre and perinatal psychology and somatic psychology, and he it blended a lot with biodynamic, this version of craniosacral, and he brought the pause principle into our work. And just taking that pause and just feeling your body. What is my body feeling? What do I feel in my body? Not getting into story, not getting into concepts, just, I feel my feet. I have a cold right hand and a warm left hand, just basic stuff like that. And just jump in if you have any questions. So, this is how we're wired. We have the iceberg. This is an iceberg, and we're kind of operating up here mostly. Unless you're a cranial therapist, you might be a little bit more in the conscious mind. But the subconscious mind controls all the systems in your body. It's got the intelligence. It's got, literal meanings and metaphorical meanings, which is the metaphorical's more right-brained. It's non-linear. Doesn't matter if it's past, present, future. It feels like right now. It can feel like a movie. It generalizes things. And this is the mind that kind of carries those early imprints. And then we kind of go out in life and kind of look at life through the lens of those imprints. And some of them need support, and they start to rise up in sessions and create a painful hip, or create headaches, or create digestive issues. And so cranial biodynamic is a way to kind of tap into those through the body and work with them. Does that make sense? Mhm. Biodynamic cranial is a bridge. This is a Kate Clemmer thing. It's a bridge between the intelligence that breathes every cell at all times. supporting that expression of the blueprint into the body. And that's why I love this work, because I like to call it energy work. A lot of the other teachers don't like that, but I'm going to call it, I think it's energy work. And I think it's really bringing the energy work into the body and really connecting it very strongly with all the cells. And when the intelligent energy is connected, people are healthier. There's more what they call coherence. And when there's more coherence, there's better autonomic nervous system regulation, there's better health, there's better heart rate variability, there's the vagus nerve is more effective. Um, People sleep better, their digestion is better, their blood pressure is better, their body is less inflamed. So the work is very, very grounded work. That's why I like it. I've studied energy work with Rosalind Briere many, many years ago. And I used to feel like when I'd get out of a class for 5 days, I couldn't really feel my feet on the ground from studying with her. She was a medicine woman with Lakota, but this work is very grounded. Did someone say something? Okay. So these subconscious imprints can come into our awareness when we're in relationship with these tides and stillness. And that's great, because those tides and stillness, those are those things called resources. So it's very, very safe when these things come into the field, come into the awareness, because the tides, the long tide, the mid tide, still points, those are all internal resources in the body that are very soothing to the body. So things are a lot less overwhelming. So the way that we kind of work with these imprints, and this is kind of like a pause, is we're kind of noticing our thoughts, noticing our feelings, noticing our body, focusing on the health, not what's wrong, but what's right. Noticing the tides, focusing on the still point. That's really what the training is about. And this background picture is a picture of our school. Like right next to the school is a little elementary school. And Debbie and I spent 2 years renovating this Oddfellows Hall, and it came out really nice. And so this picture is a little sunset from the building. Up in the middle of, it's on the Mohawk Trail in the Berkshires, kind of between Greenfield and North Adams. And Vermont's like 20 minutes north, really close to Vermont. So just a little bit of vocabulary. Tissue motility is basically you're feeling the tissue being breathed by the mid-tide. It's a mid-tide languaging. So you're hearing that. We call the mid-tide, that breath, that inhalation, exhalation, we call that primary respiration. And we call airway breathing secondary respiration. So it's the basic ordering force in the human body system all throughout your life. So it's like your little friend. That's why I like it. It's like having a good friend that you can lean on all the time. And then when you're around other cranial therapists, they can sit next to you, or they can put their hands on your feet or your shoulder. They can tune into it. And then you can both feel that support all the time. It's very soothing. It's a very soothing place to go and orient to. And what happens when you're a cranial therapist sometimes is when you're around people that talk, and you spend the weekend with somebody, and then you have a break, you're like, I can tune into the blueprint and the tides again. Because sometimes when people are like me right now, talking nonstop, it's harder to kind of tune into those things. It does require things kind of quieting down and slowing down. I say it's a lot like deer, if you've ever observed deer, how they can kind of just stop and listen, and they can tell you notice them. And the mid tide is like that, and the long tide is like that. You have to just get very quiet and still and stay in your midline, stay grounded. And then the deer, it might come up and say hi, and but if you were to, jump around and start talking, it'll probably jump over the fence and off it goes. You won't feel it again. Another aspect of our work that is really coming into the training is about attachment and neuroscience and touch. And, our attachment, I don't know if you've heard of attachment imprinting when we're young. We have attachment styles and things like that. And um, they can really influence our personality. And, we first attach with our mother by attaching to the uterus and connecting to her that way. And then we attach to our surround when we're born, the people around that are raising us. And, the first year or two is known as the fourth trimester. It's like another layer of attachment. It's another layer of um, where we really need to be connected to other people to survive. It's like vital for us to survive. We can't come out of the come out of the birth process and like a little foal or a lamb and walk away, right? We have to be carried and kept warm and nursed and all those things. So, it's so important. Relationships are so important when we're little. That's how we survive. And so when we become adults, those things that we experienced as babies, we start to relate to other people the way that we were related to when we were little. And that comes up a lot with um, different patterns that arise in your practice with people with trauma or physical health issues. And I don't know if anyone knows about the ACE study, Adverse Childhood Experience Study, and all those things really influence our health. And cranial can really support healing some of those deep, deep attachment imprints. Being with other people that are supportive and open hearted and nurturing and grounded and settled really brings about the tides and brings about healing. Just somebody that's attuned is healing, that doesn't have an agenda, that's just listening and being with you, orienting to your health, not we have to fix this and we have to fix that. A lot of clients when they come in, oh, my hip hurts and I have headaches and I've had a concussion and, I've had this for 3 years. And, you give them one session and how are you doing the next session? Oh, I'm no better. And you have to be kind of a little bit, well, especially in Massachusetts, you have to be like late. Well, you've had this for 3 years and I'm sorry, but it's going to take some time. But then, if you can get them to come in consistently, by the sixth session, they finally drop in. And then their nervous system starts to realize we're not doing anything. We're going to just strengthen what you already have and enhance that, magnify that, listen to you, be with you, support you. Then all of a sudden, these intelligent forces start getting stronger and stronger. And the person is like, wow, I really felt something shift this time. But that usually does not happen on the first visit because people are used to seeing a practitioner for a reason, and they feel like they have to dig up a reason, even if they don't have one. They have to have something wrong with them instead of something right with them. So this health that we talk about, this blueprint, these tides, they're always available, but they can just get blocked, partly blocked. So we just help that get through to their system. We remind them. We augment space. A lot of what we do in our work is we augment space. That's what works about 90% of the time. That's a very, very, very advanced concept, but I think it's good to just, as I teach, I always like repeat things a lot so that people can start to get the gist of things. Much of the work is nonverbal. So it's by being in a group of people and working together and settling into your own midline and your own body and your own biosphere. Can't really be learned from a book because it's relational. You have to learn it in relationship. It's mostly experiential. It's very hard to explain. We're talking about things that science hasn't caught up to. And we're talking about how your body heals a cut beyond all the cells and the atoms we're talking about what underpins the atoms. That is what we're discussing. And we simplify it a lot, and we also figure out who we're talking to. Are we talking to an engineer? Are we talking to a talk therapist? Are we talking to a yoga teacher? And we explain it based on which person we're talking to. And sometimes it's tough, but younger people are amazing, and they're, starting to know more about this stuff than when I was younger. Nobody knew what this was. You'd go to a party and what do you do for work? I would just say I'm a chiropractor. Everybody knows what a chiropractor is. I'm a chiropractor. I wouldn't even talk about applied kinesiology, chiropractic, or, you know, the version of chiropractic I do. I just say chiropractor. Oh, car mechanic. I get it. Okay. But more and more people are starting to really get this work. So the two big ideas is that the whole body expands and contracts with this mid-tide, like this picture here. That's exhalation in blue and inhalation in red. And then there's this energetic intelligence that is expressed that's directing this primary respiration. This is a kind of a picture. If you want to watch this on YouTube, go to my YouTube channel, and it kind of shows, it's like a picture of the mid-tide. You can kind of see it. I'm going to be showing that in my training. So Dr. Sutherland was kind of the guy that really took cranial work and kind of made it like a sub-profession of osteopathy. And he put it into this category of 5 elements of primary respiration, which is that the cranial bones are breathing, the dural connective tissues is breathing, the ventricles are breathing, and the sacrum is breathing. That's how I say it as a biodynamic. He says it a little bit more mechanistically, articular mobility of the cranial bones. Now, what happened to Dr. Sutherland is he got his socks knocked off because he got very narrow in the beginning, and he looked at the bones in the skull, a disarticulated skull, and he was like, wow, it looks like they're built to move. There's like, this one looks like a hinge, and this one looks like a sliding joint. It was very much like a carpenter or a car mechanic. and he put wet leather around his head, and as it dried, it was putting pressure. He had made a helmet putting pressure in certain positions, and he'd record his symptoms based on that. He studied all the nerves that exit the brain and all the cranial nerves and what little holes they go through. And so he was very much into the anatomy, which is very important to know, because it's like the language. It's like you want to understand Italian if you're in Italy. It's the language of the body. But then, like what we're doing, he got together with his pals, Dr. Becker and even Dr. James Jellis and Dr. Viola Fryman, all these osteopaths. And they said, what's this other thing? Do you feel this other thing that's like 10 to 12 seconds and it seems to go off the body and then it comes back in 10 to 12 seconds? Because Dr. Sutherland was just doing that CRI thing really locally, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 on different holds. But when him and his colleagues got together, they were like, there's this other thing going on. This is after 20 years of doing 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And they named it, what are we going to call it? They said, oh, we'll call it the mid-tide. And then they got together again a few years later. It's like, Dr. Sutherland's in his 80s. What's this thing that's like, it goes out way beyond the body. It doesn't have any imprints on it. 50 seconds, they timed it. Then it comes back. What are we going to call that? Let's call it the long tide. So the biodynamic work, this version of the work, is what Dr. Sutherland was talking about after doing cranial work for like 40 years. For 40 years, he did 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And that's what happened to me when I was a practitioner. I did 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 for 15 years with my practice. And then I was like, wait a minute, that is not all there is. There is some other stuff happening. And my friends were like, you got to go to England. That's where they're teaching that. And I thought, okay, I'm going to go. And then I just went to England to the class, and it was still 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And then Michael Kern showed up. So then I basically got woke in the cranial planet. I'd already been woke before, but just another layer. And you guys are lucky. I was like 38 years old. I had done the 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3 from when I was like 24 to 38.
I have a question, if that's
Yeah,
okay. If this is too off topic, you don't have to answer. But
sure.
I was just curious if you could speak to cranial nerves, like a cranial nerve palsy.
Policy?
Palsy.
Palsy, yes. I thought you were talking about politics for a second. It's like the Muppets, you hear things. So yes, yeah, I mean, with the cranial nerves, sure, you can get imprints on them. You can get viral imprints, Bell's palsy, right? You can get an infection, a viral infection in the facial nerve, and you get a sag, right? You can get stroke, right? That affects a cranial nerve, and someone's face, is dragging. You can get um, inflammation. They have all these fancy names: Bell's palsy, tic de la Rue, gastroparesis. But this work can potentially help that. But the thing is that you're going to, when you work with someone's system, you work with what the breath of life shows you. So it might not show you the foramen that, the jugular foramen where the vagus nerve comes out, or the foramen spinosum where the facial nerve comes out, a branch of the facial nerve comes out. It might say, hey, Go to the pelvis. Oh, there's an emotional layer here. Oh, let's go to the shoulder. And then the body starts to tell you the story. And so maybe the third visit, you go to the foramen spinosum, and that's the layer that it works on. So it's a little different. It's not like, oh, you have a facial nerve palsy, we're going to go here. That's more traditional osteopathy. That's more up ledger work. I'm going to go here and I'm going to kind of like see what's going on with that nerve, because we're working on the whole field. So, something going on with your foot could ostensibly affect your fascial system and affect the tentorium, affect your temporal bone where that nerve comes out. So the perceptual field is a lot wider. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thank you. It was more of a personal curiosity with
Yeah.
being an East Coaster with a history of Lyme disease and
Oh, yeah.
all these, but thank you. It seems like an art.
Yes. Art is a good way. That's why I like the training, because I'm kind of a hybrid person myself with science and healing, and science, I do both. I'm kind of one of those kind of bridge kind of people. And so both are I like both together instead of either just all science, Harvard Medical School, or all, you know, healing work, but to combine the two. Yeah, and Lyme is quite the journey. It's a big issue around here. And you know, it likes to imprint our cells and our mitochondria and influence ganglions, and yeah. And a lot of issues for people too are how our body reacts to the inflammation, the inflammation it causes, and working with the immune system to, like, whoa, immune system, regulate the immune system, and then it's less severe on people. So it's complex. And cranial work is great with, like, balancing and regulating the immune system and having it be less of a trip switch, where it can get really inflamed. And yeah. So when we sit like this guy sitting here, we're not in a rush. We're just waiting. We're waiting for the deer to step into the lawn and say hello. We're not trying to change things. We're not worrying about the results. And we're just kind of, this person here in a cranial session is saying, oh, that's a mountain. I see the mountains. The sun is rising or setting here. There's the water. There's a little cloud over there I can see in the reflection, maybe. Just naming that anatomy and being with it. And Dr. Still used to talk about taking an Indian look, at people's systems when he worked. He's the original osteopath. This is what he's talking about. This is what the natives do. They just listen to the body and get information. But you got to kind of get your mind, and you have to be patient. You have to be really patient. Yeah. So there's two phases of primary respiration. There's inhalation and exhalation. Inhalation, we kind of shorten and widen. In exhalation, we narrow and lengthen. One thing that's kind of cool was, some cranial people took a tooth mold. They took a mold of the teeth and then they did cranial work. and then they compared it to after, and it was different. Like they measured all the teeth. So it kind of shows that the bones are kind of breathing and moving. Your facial bones also breathe like a flower in the front. They kind of breathe and open and close the sinuses. And so the breath of life is the basic constitution of the body. People that spend a lot of time hanging out in the breath of life, things don't bother them the way they bother other people. Or if they do, they know what to do to settle back down and re-resource. So it's a really nice tool to have and teach people to orient to. Meditation kind of does this, but this is more of a embodied way of doing that. And especially when you do this in relationship with another person, it's like co-meditating together in a way, but it's more augmenting. It's a bit more augmenting than that. There's a lot more power with another person being in the process with you. What can happen sometimes is there's a still point where things just take a little pause and the tides might stop and things might wobble or um, spin or buzz or discharge. So we name those still points. And like I said, the long tide is like constantly going all the time in the background. But during a still point, it's still happening, but we're mostly listening to that part of the orchestra that's just taking a pause. And the perceptual field in our work, like I was saying, is we really learn to track our own system quite a bit and the person on the table. So it's not just about working on the other person. There's a lot of self orientation and self regulation, settling. One of the things that happens a lot when you do this work is you feel sometimes what's happening in the other person in your own system. And that's how you learn what's happening for them. They're called mirror neurons. And that's how we have compassion and empathy is we feel what the other person is going through in our own body. And sometimes, the training is 2 years to learn all these different ways of listening and tools and things, but also to learn about how to handle that, how to handle feeling what's happening in the other person system, and staying regulated around that and knowing that it's their system and not your system. Have you ever been in like a pretty good space and then you start hanging around someone and then you start having these feelings you didn't have before? Like maybe you feel agitated or you feel happy or you're going into resonance with their field. So, we talk about when that happens, these things called practitioner fulcrums that you set before you give a session, where you ground through your midline into the earth and you slow your system down. And before you start the session, you do an inventory about how you're doing. So you kind of know where you're at before you begin your day. And then you can start to differentiate and be clear and hopefully not get overwhelmed. Because we learn that as babies. When we're babies, we regulate from our mom. That's how we learn to regulate our nervous system. So it's just a natural thing to be around people that are in your morphogenic field, as Rupert Sheldrake talks about, this author I love, and British guy. People that are close in your family, your loved ones. It's really helpful to practice that differentiation. Well, how am I doing? Okay, and then with this person, I feel this, and just to start practicing that. And that's going to come up when you start giving sessions. So this is the last slide. My website, Divine Structure, this name finally came to me about a year ago during a session. I was like, oh, that's what it is. It's Divine Structure. So we finally got the name for the school after, I don't know, 6 years. And so we're going to do an online anatomy class. And then for those that are interested, if we can get 3 students, and if anybody's local, we will do like a day of lab and like learn to feel the shoulder and the neck and the back and the muscles and what's where. And it's kind of a fun thing to do the lab. It's 6 modules. It's probably going to be, like a half day. And, we just need 3 people to get that rolling. We'll do it once a month. Then in September, I'll be teaching a 5-day in-person intro. And it's also going to be module 1 of the full training. And so we're starting a training in September. And it'll be in Charlemont in person. And we'll keep practicing all the safety COVID things of, space. It's a nice big space. We're not going to have a ginormous class. We're going to have the max is 14 students. I don't really like doing big classes because sometimes people fall through the cracks with big classes, and I like smaller, more, I like smaller groups. And yeah, it's an intense training. That's why I have the first class is also a 5-day intro, and then after that I kind of want to sit down with people and see if it's a good fit. And but a lot of it is about you know um, doing a lot of trades, and we do usually 2 lectures a day, and we do a trade or 2 a day. And um, there's a lot of community and support with other students, and um, all kinds of people take it, people that have never done any body work, and then people that have done a lot of body work, and then people that are psychologists and psychotherapists and um, x-ray techs and all kinds of people.